hello everybody attending us for the last web talk of the series on cultural leadership. Today we had some problems while recording it and we need to apologize that the first 2 minutes of the first input are missing. So I tried to give my little introduction again and we try to fix it. So this is the last web talk on the series on cultural leadership, and today we have Dr. Toby S. Jenkins-Henry with us from the USA, from Columbia, and we also have as guests from London, Jonathan Mays from Clore Leadership, and Dr. Johan Kolsteeg from the Netherlands, from the University of Groningen. So we have these three international perspectives on the topic of cultural leadership, and we are going to talk mainly about how can we learn cultural leadership and what skills are needed specifically for it. We have the first input from Jonathan Mays, who is head of strategic partnerships and impact at Clore Leadership in London. Previously, he will tell us later about this program. Previously, he was a director of residencies and regional programs at the Philharmonia Orchestra and worked in management teams at the Chicago and Pittsburgh Symphonies. He has also worked at the Arts Council England, specifically on cultural policy and investment strategies for orchestras. Today, he will tell us about Clore Leadership as a dynamic and inclusive resource for future leaders in the arts.
So what distinguishes a good leader for a large metropolitan art gallery, for example, might be so radically different from the leadership qualities you have that you see as essential to run, say, a small dance or theatre company working with a marginalized community locally. So next, I want to think about what traits and traits there might be which might be consistent across those diverse expressions of leadership. I would venture to suggest that there aren't many, and maybe one of the only universal qualities that we'd see in good leadership is strength of conviction. You can't lead well if you don't believe in what you do. And this is all about context. So perhaps the best answer to that first question about what distinguishes a good leader is to think about how well an individual operates within their context. Are they able to articulate their strength of conviction in ways which are relatable to the people they're leading? And can they make themselves understood? To understand our present context of leadership, particularly over the last 12 months in COVID, I think it might be quite informative to look historically at the changing face of leadership. I'm hoping my colleagues here on the web talk might go further into this area as well. Clore Leadership was established in 2003, and we had a really clear agenda at our beginning to shift the leadership of the UK's cultural sector away from what had been almost exclusively male preserve. Why was it nearly all cultural institutions were being run by men? And the founder at the time, Vivian Duffield, was really impassioned by this. She still is. She's still involved and she still cares deeply about this. What are the gaps in training? Where were the failures of imagination to see the potential of women in leadership roles? And of course, this is a wider societal issue and not exclusive to the arts. We've also moved on significantly since 2003. So 18 years later, there have clearly been some shifts in the gender balance, perhaps not enough yet, but we're also thinking about other areas of expressing diversity. So imbalances in multiple characteristics such as ethnicity, age, sexuality, even nationality. So what is brought by these moves towards wanting to see more diversity in the who of leadership is a greater understanding of the many possible whats of leadership. What did those mostly men who were leading our cultural institutions prior to 2003 have in common? Beyond their gender, I would argue that most also had a tendency towards the heroic. A leader was somebody who could come and save the day, could demonstrate strength and an unbending dedication to the cause. This was not, of course, universal, but it was perhaps the idealized model of leadership. Those leadership qualities aren't necessarily bad things, but I think we would all recognize now how limiting they might be. With a wider variety and diversity of leaders, we will inevitably see a wider range of styles of leadership. Take, for example, and I'm sorry for this example, but I really like it, two political leaders whose tenures overlapped and whose leadership styles were recently compared by an American entrepreneur called Margaret Heffernan. The first is Tony Blair. He was British Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007. He was well known for his style of rhetoric and his heroic leadership. He displayed charisma and really great conviction. His style might be typified as analysing available data and then making a strong decision by which he stuck. Britain's involvement in the Second Iraq War is a case in point. He made a decision and it wasn't going to change. In contrast, Heffernan looks at the approaches taken by Angela Merkel, whose first 2 years in office overlapped with Tony Blair. Merkel is almost the anti-hero leader. She employs a decision-making process which is much more incremental, only committing to as much as is strictly necessary until she has further information in which decisions can be made. Now, I'm highlighting these examples not really to make a value judgment about those two leaders, more to display how a greater variety of types of leader will lead to a greater variety of styles, some of which are better suited to the increasingly varied world that we live in. And I would argue that, for example, when related to COVID, the approach taken by Angela Merkel in the long run has been much more beneficial in terms of how leadership style has benefited the German response. The arts are certainly more open to new modes of leadership. They are by their very nature like that. But some art forms are perhaps less so, and I count amongst those the one that I come from, orchestral music. So before being here at Clore Leadership, I was in the orchestral sector, both in America and in the UK. And I think it serves as a good example for an area of cultural life that is struggling to catch up with other parts of the sector. And I was wondering about this ahead of today's talk. Is it because of the inbuilt hierarchy in the way an orchestra organizes itself? There are clearly defined roles within instrument groups and between sections of the orchestra, and ultimately a conductor at the helm. And even that terminology, the word helm in English, takes us back to seafaring and traditionally male heroic images of a captain on a ship. There are, of course, examples in the orchestra sector where this model of leadership is being challenged. And I'd like to give a couple of examples which I think are really interesting here. The Italian ensemble Spira Mirabilis, for example, rather than just thinking of themselves as an orchestra without a conductor, which actually wouldn't be totally unique, lots of those exist, they have reimagined an orchestra as a laboratory, as a place to learn, in which the responsibility for musical decision-making and interpretation is devolved across the musicians. I can't actually imagine a better example of where collective responsibility and dispersed leadership is given. And another orchestral example, the Nevis Ensemble here in Scotland, they explicitly moved away from the idea of a single all-powerful conductor towards a more dispersed model as well, with two or possibly more conductors being involved with all aspects of concert giving and decision-making. Holly Mattison, one of the joint artistic directors of that ensemble, has articulated the consequent benefits of this model very, very clearly. She summed it up as a process of moving the leadership away from the top and into the middle. I think those are really good examples for where you can change leadership styles and structures and really benefit in the what of leadership. One final example here to share is a theatre company here in the UK, and I would encourage everybody on this call to go and have a look at their website and read about them. They're called Access All Areas, and they present disruptive theatre and performance by learning disabled and autistic artists. For an organisation like this, with the work on stage being designed and performed by a specific set of people, it makes real sense that the governance of the organisation can also reflect that dispersed leadership. They've taken the bold step of appointing a co-chair and co-deputy chair on their board of directors, who are both drawn from the performing company and both have learning disabilities. Now, that's not easy to achieve. Nobody's saying it's easy, but it is possible. And I think it's a real amazing story to have the embodiment of your leaders operating in the context, that context I mentioned earlier. They are the people who the work is being delivered to, and they themselves are in the decision making. So I hope you can see a bit more clearly from those examples what it looks like when you can have leadership in all sorts of forms. At Clore Leadership, we increasingly think of leadership as it might be expressed at all levels in an organization, so not traditionally just at the top. This has meant that when we started in 2003, we had a very singular fellowship offer, just to a handful of people each year, very intensive, very in-depth. And over the last 18 years, particularly the last decade, we've moved to a situation where we offer all sorts of courses, all sorts of offer to people at the beginning of their career, in the middle of their career, to leaders who are from minority backgrounds, to those with lived experience of disability, and so on. We've had to expand and broaden what we are doing in training of leaders in order to be able to best meet the need from the sector. And back to one of those initial questions, really, to finish. Can leadership skills be learned? And the answer to that from us at Clore Leadership is very squarely yes. I hope some of the examples I've given to you will show why, because there isn't a singular leadership. On all of our training, we ask our participants to undertake some form of self-analysis to discover what's authentic for them. And authenticity in leadership means discovering how to utilize your behaviors, strengths, and traits in order to lead. Of course, there are tools, and whilst many of these tools can be learned on the job, I think there's huge merit in stepping away from the day-to-day to give ourselves professional nourishment. And that's the point at which Clore Leadership steps in. Now, the last year has been one in which leadership has been tested like no other in our lifetime. From the point of view of research into leadership practices, I think it's amazing. The disruption caused by COVID-19 couldn't be more interesting. It's a global phenomenon, so you can really measure across countries and across different things where normally you wouldn't have a consistent factor. So we can really look at what leadership is successful, what is working, and we can look at how a country values its arts, for example, the political leadership. So you could look at the ratio for financial support for the sector. What are political leaders willing to provide to keep organizations going? And how resilient are different forms of leadership? So where are we seeing organizations thriving in the crisis rather than just surviving? At times of crisis, we also see just how valuable the training and the networks that we provide are. And I'd like to close with 3 leadership lessons that we at Clore Leadership have taken over the past year. I think they're really useful things to think about as you're considering leadership. First, it's critically important to be timely with your interventions. Acting late, waiting too long is nearly useless when everything is moving at fast pace. So always try and be timely. The second, modeling good practice is essential. Anything that doesn't model good practice really sticks out. And the last, and I think perhaps most important in our context, put people first. It's more than just a mantra. It's a philosophy that has to thread through everything we're doing in terms of leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. This was great to give us at the end a sort of a checklist where we can measure all the attempts in going further into cultural leadership. And I think the attendees will appreciate that you give also practical examples that they can have a look. I saw that directly there was a question about the company you just mentioned, because I think you also said it, the role model. Yeah, you need even at this point, you need examples where you can follow, where you can see, have the vision what this means. I see, yeah, now the questions are coming in. And the first one is asking about models of collective leadership. If this is an issue at Clore, I saw that you have an essay or something like this on the website. If you browse through the website, you find something on collective leadership, right?
It's a good question. It really is, because of course, actually in its very essence, what we're asking when we're asking that question about collective leadership is one of are people willing to relinquish some of the responsibility that might typically sit within a singular position? So I think the answer to that is yes, of course, it's always an issue. And when we're training leaders, we are asking them to explore those sorts of things directly. What are they willing to give up in order to be able to share leadership? I think it would be helpful maybe to think of it less as that a singular model where, say, a chief executive has to do it in a shared way, but more across a range of ideas. Who is given the responsibility for decision making? You know, where does a budget in an organization sit, and how do you share that? Where do you, as the old, you know, perhaps you're the chief executive, but you're giving some of the responsibility away there. And I think the more nuanced you can think of that, the easier it is to understand and comprehend exactly how you might have that sort of more dispersed leadership. It's one of many models. And I think, you know, what we at Clore Leadership are doing is training others, so we're not necessarily putting that into direct practice ourselves. So I wouldn't want to say more beyond that.
And we have one more question, then we have a look at the time and go further. But Paul Fabel asks, what exactly do you mean by modeling good practices is essential? Modeling as in how? Cheers. Sending you.
I think, look, I imagine that most of us here can probably remember or even point to specific examples of where somebody has asked you to do something in a job or in a role, and it feels contradictory because they're operating in a different way. So I think the first point of answer to that type of question is, it simply is the person who is sitting in a leadership position willing to put themselves there? Are they honestly able to see the implications of what they're asking, and therefore understanding where you as somebody operating, what you might need from them as a leader? So I think that's a starting point. Of never really truly as a leader asking something which you don't honestly think you would do yourself in the same position. The other best way maybe to answer this question is to sort of simply look at organizations who are putting that into practice. In the UK, we've got a number of organizations that we've been highlighting where their response to the COVID-19 crisis, I think, embodies exactly this. There's a number of theatre companies who have, in recognition of the fact that they can't deliver traditional theatre, have changed and are delivering food, or are, you know, thinking about what it means to meet their core objectives as an organization. If your core objective says the reaching of audiences, well, there are many ways that you can achieve that, and putting into practice those sorts of things, I think, is a really good way of saying that's what you're doing when
that's a great way of looking at this term cultural leadership, and maybe we can take it again for the final discussion. For this moment, I would very warm thank you for the input, and move over to the next input and welcome again Dr. Johan Kolsteeg. He is a musicologist who has worked in both contemporary and classical music, and then he moved to the arts management, education and research at the Utrecht University of the Arts, and did his PhD on strategy formation in cultural organizations. He's currently working at the University of Groningen in a master's program on cultural leadership and researching audience development for the North Netherlands area. I will share also the link right now. And Johan Kolsteeg will talk about how to transfer academic research into processes of cultural leadership. Thank you for attending, and the stage is yours, Johan.
Thank you. And I am going to try and share my screen now. Oops, I think I'm already sharing it. That's not what I wanted to share. There we go. And I just wanted to refer to Jonathan by saying that I'm quite impressed by my own biography. Oops, sorry. Oh, sorry, I'm moving the wrong direction. Oh, okay, now you've seen it. Okay, I work at the University of Groningen and I'm connected to the research master Cultural Leadership that we have developed over there a few years ago. Before I start, I just would like to thank Jonathan for your input and for your confirmation and of the fact that we owe a lot of very relevant thinking and researching on cultural leadership to the UK. The Clore program is to thank for that as well. And we are usually working together with our colleagues in the UK a lot on developing research ideas. So before, I'm just going to discuss a little bit an alternative perspective, you might say, to what Jonathan has just put forward on cultural leadership. And obviously, from an academic and research master perspective, it is different, of course, from the perspective that Clore has as a very practical and institution in the field. So how we look at cultural leadership is as a discursive and curatorial and in fact emergent and possibly distributive practice. Now that's a mouthful, but it means that we look at how the term cultural leadership is given meaning, in fact, on different levels in discourses. The illustrations you can see on the left-hand side are obviously Barroso, who introduced culture into the European discussion on cultural identity, and the bottom illustration is about a project that was done on how do we deal with robotics in our life and how does post-humanism affect our thinking already, perhaps. So these are examples of how cultural leadership is, on the one hand, a discourse, and at the same time, a curatorial practice. It is not necessarily, however, in our idea, linked to one person. It could very well be a distributive practice. Sometimes it's hard to retrace whoever started with this great idea, but it's happening and actually it's picking up and there is movement in society and in the cultural field. And at one point, you cannot really remember anymore how things started. So things emerge and are picked up by anyone who wants to participate. An interesting aspect of that perspective, at least in my research, is the relationship between global and local. So how is the term cultural leadership and all this aspect given meaning on a global scale, and how does that affect local cultural identity work, for instance, the groundwork. In any rate, we are interested in practices that show how the relationship between arts and societal debate is being strengthened. One of the questions that was put forward before the start of this presentation was about the new emergence of the concept, and that's a really good question, because I think that we have to be careful, especially if you have the discursive perspective as your point of departure, like we do, that it doesn't become a floating signifier, just like we had before cultural entrepreneurship or cultural diplomacy. They all have meanings, but they also have meanings in different contexts, depending on who you speak with. You may need to adapt your understanding of the term cultural leadership. So it's up to us really, and to actually to keep up the discussion and see what does it mean and how can it be operationalized in a practical and theoretical way as well. Yes, let's see what. Here we go. So yes, as it happens, my background is in music as well, as a programmer of symphony orchestra. So I took an example to illustrate how we see something like an emergent practice, in this case connected to a very clear personal leader. which is the Berlin Phil and Simon Rattle. So asking the question, is cultural leadership perhaps a superlative of cultural management? It's an astonishing accomplishment to be the leader of a symphony orchestra like the Berlin Philharmonic to begin with, and it requires all kinds of personal leadership qualities that are not very broadly distributed among people. So it really is a talent to be that. At the same, but is that leadership, or could you say that that's being a conductor? And on top of that, there's the practice that Simon Rattle developed to bring the orchestra into completely different contexts and to bring classical music into different contexts. In other words, to redefine the relationship between the symphony orchestra and society, very, very practically, very directly. So there's also, sometimes you don't even recognize the development, but you see that this is more than being a conductor. This is where leadership starts, bringing the art, in this case, classical music, further. And that, of course, has gigantic implications for the organization and requires leadership in terms of handling the situation and organizing things, etc. But it starts with the ambition and the need to bring the creative work further than in the context where it all started. Now the question is, of course, how to research that. How can you grasp these practices, and how can you say something sensible about it that other people might find interesting to hear about as well? Our approach is multifaceted. It's qualitative, of course. We look at it from a grounded approach. It's about sense-making practices, understanding. It's about analyzing, and a critical and cognitive approach are both involved that as well. The illustrations that you can see here happen to be two projects that we are doing in the north at the moment, research that we did there, the north of the Netherlands, of course, which are both about the topic of inclusivity, which is yet again a floating signifier. You know, what does it mean, and how does that work out in terms of, for instance, the relationship between global and local discourses. And these are completely different examples of that. Of projects involving that topic, but they're both experimental in the sense that they really bring the organizations outside their comfort zone and really in a space where they have to try out and experiment with things that they're not usually very happy with. So the right-hand inclusivity is practice. It says it's about how an organization shows leadership by continuously, reflectively redefining itself, both internally and in the organization of its relationship with the outside world. And it really takes risks in that practice. It's very aware of the dangers of that type of practice, because every time they need funding, for instance, and it turns on to fund projects that have to do with inclusivity, they run into complete misunderstandings about the way that they try to do things, and that doesn't fit with the setup that we are used to work in the Netherlands. But they are very convinced, and they actually bring that topic of inclusivity on a next level. The Proeftuin is a bigger organization, research setup where about 15 cultural organizations in the north work together in finding a new audience, inspired in fact by German research on the Nichtbesucher. So how can we get in contact, in dialogue with people who are not used to visiting our organizations, which is a tricky topic for many institutions, and it takes a lot of guts to actually to start that conversation. It's as simple as that. So both are unpredictable practices, and both can only be researched if you connect closely to them, and if you actually sit next to the people who are in that practice, and if you help them by reflection to give a broader context to their work and together create the knowledge that you need in order to draw some conclusions from that practice. So someone asked, what do you need to actually be able to research and to investigate cultural leadership? I think it's, for me at least, it really requires you to have a very critical curiosity to how things work, to machinations, to how the inside view really works out. And at the same time, you need historical context and future orientation, and you need a very sound theoretical grounding in order to make sense of what you are observing. A few more of the questions that were asked. Has research been done on generational differences in cultural leadership styles? And this is a really interesting question. I would like to know who asked that. And because it's a weak point in our research, actually. It's whereas we are in the cultural field very aware of the differences of sense-making practices between generations. And we've become aware, at least in our country, because there is not enough audience from a younger generation being added to the audience of institutionalized culture. So we need to be worried about that. Why does it? And for some reason, I don't think there's been some research done, at least not in the Netherlands, about how leadership styles differ from in different generations, which I think is critical, because in a few years' time, cultural leaders will be much younger than they are now. Probably, if I look at around me, it's really time for a generational change, which is going to happen one way or another. So I'm not aware of that that type of leadership of generational research, but perhaps Jonathan knows more about that. But it's really a very interesting and important topic to be looking at. Can leadership be learned? Yes. Well, according to Jonathan, it certainly can. And I agree in the sense that the person who asked that question actually added to that, isn't it a combination of attitude and life tasks? That's very difficult to learn from books, but definitely you can learn from life and become a better leader by just picking up what you need as instruments to function as a leader. And that the research master that we do in Groningen is not about learning people to be a leader in the way that Jonathan actually describes the capacities of leadership. But you do, of course, observe people becoming a leader by just simply being connected to that field and developing ambitions and ideas about how things should be done better. I think I'm still in the time, but...
Yes, 1 minute.
1 minute, yeah. Great.
Do you still have to show something or tell us something, or can we? This was a great input, and I'm quite happy because I think it leads very well over to the third input, and we can have a good discussion at the end. Thank you for taking over the question which was sent to us before. Maybe the person who sent it in is attending us, then she can or he can give a little hint in the chat. And Eileen Michel, she pointed out that Professor Mandl, we had the first web talk with her and Armin Klein. She had this research done on the generational difference in cultural leadership, and we have this recorded on YouTube. So if anybody is interested specifically in this he or she can look it up on this YouTube video. So at the moment, I don't see questions in our box coming in, but you also picked the question who come to us in advance, and I will also link into the chat the essay you wrote together with Martin Zierold, who was also part of one of our web talks, and I read it quite carefully. It's a great also essay. You can read all things you said now in your input written out there. And I think I like the idea of this image of a heroic and hierarchical leader model you pointed out there. And the more participatory approaches are called for the arts, the more traditional heroic and hierarchical models come up. You pointed out there. I don't know if it's your opinion or Martin's, but maybe you can tell us something about this. We talked a lot about the hierarchy, yeah, about the problems of hierarchy before in our web talks, and what do you think also from the perspective of a researcher? What do we need to break these hierarchical models?
To break the hierarchical models of leadership.
Yeah.
I wish we had that power.
Yeah. It would be a good wish for a fairy tale.
Exactly. The funny thing is that one of the aspects that the organization that I was studying in Groningen addressed was actually getting rid of hierarchy. So just seeing what happens if we don't have a hierarchy. And it sounds very 60s and 70s actually, but it was done with a new and a new type of energy, and also, of course, with knowledge of the 60s and the 70s. So it was not done the same way, but it was very reflectively, very carefully, very seriously, not as a let's get rid of hierarchy, but what happens to how people cooperate, and does our organization become more democratic if we abolish hierarchy? They had to come back from that experiment a little bit, because no hierarchy doesn't work. So there was a need for some structure, for some people to be responsible, but responsibilities and hierarchies are not the same. So they actually really worked very well with that. Yeah, I think that we as researchers, what we can do is actually be close to that type of development, discuss it, publish it, reflect on it with practitioners, and see if there is space for further investigation. But it has to happen there in practice.
Yeah. But the reflection, you all mentioned it also, Jonathan, the reflection is one of the main topics you need to do. We have another question here in our box. How is cultural leadership approached towards sustainability? We had also a series of web talks on sustainability, and we have some questions coming in advance who lead to also the sustainable aims. Maybe you can answer it quickly before going to the next input.
Well, it's difficult to generalize how cultural leadership as a phenomenon relates to sustainability as a phenomenon. I think that obviously it's an area where cultural leadership can be shown. I know of a couple of festivals, for instance, who are really make it a point to have a zero environmental footprint. There's not much systematic thinking going on about how cultural leadership should relate to sustainability, but there's definitely examples of initiatives. Jonathan, do you have any more input on that?
Sorry, getting my unmute. Only to say that I agree with you. I think it's very hard to encapsulate that into a massive question, into quite a small answer. But in the UK, certainly, we've perhaps divested some of the responsibility from the sector at whole and trying to put it into individual organisations who lead charge around sustainability in the arts. The one that's best known is called Julie's Bicycle. I'll put a link in.
We had the hint for Julie's Bicycle several times, and I think we can pick it up for the final panel discussion again, because I know that people attending us, they always think around this idea of sustainability. And thank you very much, Johan, for your input as far as now. And let me now move on to the third input, which is from Dr. Toby S. Jenkins-Henry. She is Associate Professor of Higher Education and Director of the Museum of Education at the University of South Carolina, and is attending us from Columbia now. Her work focuses on the use of culture as a politic and social survival, a tool of social change and a transformative space of creative and critical pedagogy. She is considered a national expert on cultural inclusion, and with her work, she is involved in the innovation and transformation of university cultural centers. Toby Jenkins has brought us a special insight into her work today, and we will talk to her later about her perspective on cultural leadership, which she considers to be a selfless act. Thank you, Toby, for being here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for my previous colleagues. I have been writing frantic notes as you all shared your inputs, and so I'm happy to join the conversation. I entered the study of cultural leadership with an explicit intent to lift up and honor cultures and people that have been traditionally marginalized and ignored. And I think that's really important to state. So scholars at Yale University in the United States have noted, so they've done some work around understanding what cultural history is. And they've shared that cultural history is the idea that our everyday ways of being, doing, thinking, behaving are important and noteworthy. That there's an audacity in everyday life that we often take for granted. And so, you know, as I began to first work on, do work around cultural leadership, my interest was very personal, because as I assumed senior leadership positions in organizations, I began to realize that though I studied leadership, so I was in, I'd received degrees where the study of leadership was a major component of that work. So though I studied leadership in formal institutions, I really didn't draw on that information. What made me stand out as a leader were the values, approaches, practices that I learned from my culture. I was not afraid to use my culture to guide how I led. So in my work, my current work, I examine the full spectrum of a leader's familial and neighborhood experiences, the various forms of community-based knowledge that taught a leader how to succeed and how to make a difference. I look at the core values, traditions, inherited folkways that guides a leader's sense of purpose and teaches them how to navigate society. I see cultural leadership as creative leadership. It's about ingenuity, innovation, creation. It often involves the arts, but it's not limited to the arts, because I feel strongly that we need to allow leaders in all fields to see themselves as creative, free, flexible, and imaginative. So a cultural leader is a seer. They can look at things and see new possibilities, and some have this ability because of the very history of resilience and ingenuity that they inherited from the cultural hegemony that their community has endured, right? So they found ways to love and hold up their culture, even when various societies were telling them that their culture was not important, that their culture was not, did not matter. So in many ways, it's not about charisma, influence, persuasion, or even motivation. It's about heart and soul, not about power and position, but about community and people. Cultural leaders are reflective, wise, and holistic leaders who understand that the collective of their life experience in the classroom, or as we say in the United States, on the block, in college or in church, through professional networks or through neighborhood gatherings, all of those things have made them who they are. In my work, I'm constantly posing the question, How does culture influence the way that we show up in the world? How does culture influence the way that we interact with others, the way we work, the way we lead? So in my new book, The Hip Hop Mindset as a Professional Practice, and it doesn't come out until August of 2021. But in this work, this research, I take hip hop culture and I study it deeply to understand the mindsets that the culture generates and how those mindsets translate into dynamic leadership practices within any profession. And, you know, I think I'm going to share a brief video about that particular work, but I want to share one of the reasons why I think it's beneficial to share this as an example is that the main takeaway is to be inspired to mine culture itself, right? To look at various cultures. And again, cultures that people take for granted and think have absolutely no worth. And to really critically look at them and say, what can we learn from them? What can these cultures teach us? What can the habits of these communities teach us about how to be better leaders, about how to be, better in the work that we do and how to show up differently? So I want to share with you, this is an 8-minute explainer video. So it's a little bit longer, but it is a whole book collapsed into a short video. And so I will go ahead and share my screen now for the video. And while I'm doing that, I will ask that the video's sound is pretty low. So if you could take time right now to increase the volume on your machine, so increase the volume on your computer all the way up, and you should to high, and you should be able to hear this video well. I'm a professor. I'm not an MC. I'm not a dancer. I'm not a DJ. But I am hip hop. Why? Because there are skills, habits, and behaviors that I've inherited from hip hop culture that make me shine in my career. I bring a hip hop mindset to my work, and it is one of the reasons why I and many other people who embrace hip hop culture have been so outstanding in our careers, regardless of the field. What is a mindset and why does it matter? Mindsets are about our ways of thinking, what we think and how we think, our ways of being, what we believe, and the type of person we want to be, our ways of doing, how we approach things, how we move, what we do, and how we do it. Our mindsets influence how we show up in the world. But where do our mindsets come from? For many of us, we first learn mindsets about achievement in a school and probably from our teachers, coaches, or other leaders. And they teach us that to succeed in school, we should be quiet, listen, follow directions, don't question, be a team player, which means don't disagree. But there's something about those who dare to be different. The attitudes, belief systems, personal standards, work ethic, and the overall swag these people bring to their jobs impacts their professional acumen. Some come to work, others come to slay. I'm talking about the type of people who don't just dance, they spin on their heads or stand on one arm. Folks in hip hop have these really interesting habits of mind that I believe are critical to any leader, whether you're in the field of education, business, a doctor, lawyer, community leader, consultant, or a journalist. If you're expected to create or develop, if you want to be a superstar in your field, you can benefit from a hip hop mindset. So let's unpack it. There are 3 basic mindsets in hip hop culture. Drive is about hunger, competitiveness, kinship, and honor. Approach is about creativity and originality, cultural pride and ingenuity, and also about being authentic and having integrity. And posture is about confidence, commanding attention, and claiming space. When we talk about drive, the major question is, how hungry are you for opportunity? Is a light snack enough, or are you striving for the prime rib? Of course, it's a metaphor. It's not about whether you actually eat meat. It's about the size of your dreams and your hard-headed determination to achieve them. Hunger in hip-hop means believing in yourself, your abilities, your work ethic, and your unique talents and contributions. Some folks know that even if right now they can only afford the dollar menu at the fast food drive-thru, their destiny involves a fork and knife. Who knew that a 25-year-old Jay-Z would become a mogul at 50? He knew. Winners know in their gut they are destined to shine. Drive is about dreaming, grinding, and working to fulfill your destiny. Competitiveness is about having high expectations and the ambition to be the best. Winners don't just want an opportunity, they want to win. A record deal is only a first goal. Next is a #1 song, then you want to be a #1 artist. You're always competing to top your own personal best. All professionals need this type of work ethic. We need to push ourselves to avoid getting too comfortable. Competing in sports helps me to win in a lot of ways. I'm physically fit, I'm self-confident. I've made friends who also work hard and don't sit around wasting their life. My friends push and help me to be better. Well, it's the same if I'm a teacher chasing Teacher of the Year distinction. My school wins, my students win, I win in the process, regardless of who actually receives the award. Chasing the GOAT gets you everything in the process. Our society will have you thinking hip-hop is rude, negative, and aggressive. But folks in the community know that hip-hop is about honor, grace, and community. For many students, the longer they stay in school, the more they feel like an imposter, and they're made to believe that they don't cut it, that they aren't enough. Hip-hop is a culture where the closer you get to the music, meaning the louder the music is played or the closer to the dance floor you are, the fresher you feel. It's a space of welcome. Kinship is about shining solo, but still being connected to a squad. So I'm dope, I'm #1, this is my life experience, but also my squad is dope, my crew is #1, this is our life experience. Honor is about respect, respecting the work of other artists, respecting the rules in the cipher, respecting the community broadly. Hip-hop culture values neighborhoods and people that society often sees as worthless. And honor is about being grateful for the ways that others have put you on and learning to do the same. There's a spirit of helping, connecting, and assisting in hip-hop. So ask yourself, who have I helped in my career? Have I passed the mic so someone else can shine? Being original and unique is critical in hip-hop. There's a value for innovating, being able to remix something old into something new. Hip-hop artists are seers or visionaries who can see utility in what others view as worthless. Are you able to see something in organizations, communities, people, companies that others view as dysfunctional or barren? It is the type of creative mind that can turn a record player into an instrument that you play like a guitar, or they can take a microphone and turn it into a tool for life transformation. Remixing is an essential skill. Approach is also about going in the right direction. It involves authenticity and integrity. It is about creating what matters to the people that matter to you and seeing yourself as a builder in this world. Hip-hop ed pioneer Tony Blackman says that hip-hop helped her to believe that if it doesn't exist, she can build it. But as you're building and moving, authenticity and integrity demands that you represent yourself and the community in a way that is real, clear, and true. Hip-hop is about showing up as your full self, not a watered-down version to please others. Cultural efficacy is simply cultural pride. It's about believing that you can do whatever you imagine. Before you create or build anything, you must first believe that you can. It's a respect for your culture, and it's the optimistic belief that the way we do anything is brilliant. Ingenuity is about being clever, original, and inventive. It's that magic in what you build that makes it a #1 song, or turns a building into a place kids run into, or that your staff don't want to leave. Remember, we pay to go to concerts. They don't beg, bribe, or threaten us to be there. Posture is your presence within your profession. It concerns confidence and having the guts to be a nonconformist, to tell the truth, and to try something new. It's about not allowing cultures of fear in your organization to stop you from being different in all the ways that matter. Commanding attention is about having a dynamic and engaging presence, speaking boldly and bravely, speaking in your own language and about the things that matter to your people. You speak because you know that your words matter. In hip hop, microphones project your voice. They don't quiet it. Being heard is important. Hip hop artists don't just speak to ears who aren't listening. Their words are memorized, recited, and internalized. It's about being ready to shine and knowing how to move the community. Claiming space is about owning any space that you occupy. To own it means to confidently enter, move through it, and transform it, knowing that you have the right, the talent, the skills, the ability to do so. To claim space is to reject ideas of imposter, renter, or borrower, and claim the throne as your own. In my book, The Hip Hop Mindset as a Professional Practice, Airwalking and Trash Talking, I go much deeper in explaining the hip hop mindset. It's about stretching the possibility of what you can do in a way that might even blow your own mind. That's what air walking is about, the magical way that hip hop dancers seem to walk on air. And often when we show up bad and brilliant, that leads to some trash talking. But I see braggadocio as a healthy and important form of self love among people that our society has found so many ways to hate. It's absolutely important for us to document our dopeness, tell our story, walk in the spotlight, shine the light on the work that you produce. Just remember to back that brag up with outcomes. I truly believe that embracing this kind of power, this kind of freedom, this kind of energy will make you feel as if you are dancing through your career. So, like I said, in sharing that, one of the main takeaways is my belief that even as we talk about the idea of cultural leadership, that we shouldn't forget to mine cultures themselves, to always put the cultures in the center, and to really interrogate and critically assess what we can learn from not only from historical cultures and cultural histories, but the contemporary cultures that are that surround us every day, and the brilliance that surround us within communities. So I know I'm at time.
Thank you very much for this marvelous video. I would like to know the technique, how to sketch it like this. It's really great. And we have some questions on the link to the video. I think you embedded it on your website, right? Or do you have a link from YouTube or whatever what we can share, so that...
If you I think you're going to share my website, so it will eventually get up there. Because the book doesn't come into print until August. I haven't been publicizing it too much, because then people are like, well, where do I get the book? And then it's not available yet.
Yeah. So we have the video over there on your website, and let me have a quick look if there is coming in a special question to your program, to the hip hop mindset. I'm really impressed in developing this idea of having a special focus on sort of culture. We mainly didn't directly aim when we are talking about cultural leadership, but I think it's a quite good example, and you are focusing on the leadership in underrepresented communities. And we heard before from Jonathan and also from Johan that diversity and the reflection on this is a very, very important point. And I think we can go over into this little panel discussion we can have in the last quarter of an hour to just talk in every direction. So the importance, maybe Jonathan or Johan can reflect on the hip hop mindset of, did you know before about this program? What do you think?
I love it. Toby, I really want to applaud you just for what an inventive and exciting and idea it is, but not just that, how you're using the language that isn't typically used in the context of cultural leadership. And that's exactly, I think, part of what we need to do when we're talking about diversifying leadership. If we're assuming that the world has to look the same, but the people occupying it change their ways to sit in it, then we're doing it wrong. So exactly what you're doing around that, I think, is fabulous. So just to really applaud you, Toby.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
yeah.
Very, very inspiring also to see, how mindset becomes something that you can actually reflect on as an instrument. I think it's really interesting, and I think this should be done. This type of perspective on a theme of leadership should be taken much more often.
Could I pick up a question on it? So one thing that occurs to me is...
Sure, and then let me have a look at the box, but you are free to just enter into the discussion and ask, yeah.
Toby, what I would be keen to explore is about what collaboration looks like in that model and in that mindset. You talked about squads, and I really liked that. But that feels quite sort of internal. And certainly one of the questions coming before today's session was about, can you effectively collaborate in cultural leadership terms. I'm just intrigued what that might look like in the hip hop mindset.
Yeah. So, and when I looked at the previous question, I think when it becomes complicated when you're looking at collaborating across organizations, and particularly, as I was looking at the different types of organizations. So you might have a cultural arts organization and a corporation, and then an artist. And the ways that I think what can complicate it is each one having a very different objective and bottom line coming into the collaboration, right? And again, pulling back on hip hop, those concepts of being authentic and being true and real about even why you're showing up here, what your motivations are, I think can be important, because maybe the corporation's bottom line is we want to reach this community. We're trying to, the money, and the artist is just totally on the other, end of that spectrum and everything, whatever, right? So that can cause friction. And particularly cause at least one collaborator to feel like they are having to sacrifice themselves in some way in order for the collaboration to work. And so one of the things that I looked at with the whole idea of collaboration and within hip hop was the reality is that though when you look at the squad, and I translate them to communities of practice, right? Communities of practice. In communities of practice, people have a shared passion. Everyone has some type of commitment or skill set that they're wanting to work on and get better at. And that's ultimately what the squad is about. And they come together to push and challenge each other, to help each other grow. Individually, everybody, you want everyone to have their own success, but then you might work together to have some group success or whatever. But there's still this truthfulness, this honesty, and this realness about the commitment there. And I don't think any type of collaboration across institutions and organizations will work when everyone doesn't have a very true goal in shared goal kind of coming in.
Johan?
Well, I was thinking a basic and a pivotal concept in that perspective is trust.
Yes.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is, if you look at cooperations between creative and non-creative organizations, you very quickly run into the lack of trust. In fact, sometimes even complete absence of it.
And let me put in then another perspective which is coming in via a question from Jana Eske. She asked Toby, but also Jonathan, you mentioned the male aspect in cultural leadership. What do you think about, Toby, the female perspective in cultural leadership? What can we learn from the hip hop mindset in terms of female mindsets in leadership?
Yeah, and so in one of the chapters in the book, I specifically talk about women in hip hop, and I think particularly when I'm talking about the idea of honor and kinship, because I think one of the things that I most walked away with from this research was looking at the ways that women in hip hop, the hip hop industry, when you look at it as a music industry, not just a culture, right? Because it's a broader culture. But when you just look at women who are artists in the industry, celebrities and everything, they are working within very limited parameters, very oppressive, a very oppressive industry that only allows women to enter into the industry in very limited ways, right? And so I call it body first. Like when women have to almost, have these kind of naked personas in order to even become the get the record deal and all of that or whatever. But one of the things that they have done is, despite the limited parameters, enter the space and then completely blow it up, and become exactly whoever they want, they want to be. And so, I think in many ways, and I give an example of like a Nicki Minaj, like, right. So she does both of those things. So when you look at her, she is very naked. She is very body first. You can tell that she's bending in many ways to get access. And she's getting access through a male artist and everything. But still, as an artist, she is very skilled. She has a skill set that is like second to none. And I'm not a fan of hers, but I can recognize that what she's able to do with her voice and as a rapper, a lot of people can't do that, right? So that it doesn't stop them from bringing their strong skills. And I think that's what women leaders have been doing for centuries, right? That's what they have been doing for centuries. Regardless of the circumstances, when you do get in, when you do have the space, or even if you're outside of the space, but really showing up as your full self with all of your skill, because once you have that opportunity, why waste it?
Yeah.
Why waste it? And that's what I say to anyone in a leadership position. It's a very limited time and space that you will have to lead an organization, to be in, even if it's hierarchical, to be at that top hierarchical space. So do it, transform it, bring your full self to it, but don't hesitate, because then you won't really have the deep impact that you really want to, because you're tiptoeing, trying to create change.
These are good empowermental voices for all the female leaders and all the female non-leaders listening to us. I will take another question from our box, which is directed towards Johan, and is going into the issue of universities, and again the question about hierarchy, and how do you approach the theory in your own working, the theory of cultural leadership in your own working environment. And maybe Toby, you are also in the context of a university, can join the answer.
Yes, I was hoping to answer that question secretly in the chat.
Okay. Nobody is listening. We are here in a circle.
I think it's a really good question, and perhaps even stemming from the question asker, their own observation that there's not much like that going on in university contexts. So universities are, by definition, old-fashioned and classical organizations, very difficult to change even from the inside out. Toby, what do you think?
I agree. The hierarchy is set there. The only thing that I do feel is that it's also always had this nugget of possibility with the way that faculty live at the university, right? Because in many ways, faculty, this dispersed kind of leadership, this freedom, to pursue your thing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be informed by, or you don't have a leader telling you this is what you have to do. And there is this inherent in a large population of employees on a college campus that there is this dispersed freedom and flexibility to to pursue their own goals, and everyone value that it will make the institution better.
Yeah.
That everyone doesn't have to do the same thing. I just wish that would be more fully embraced, because the reality is the way any university is run is the exact opposite of that. It's like, well, that's academic. Everything else is business. And
Yeah, we talked about organigram. Maybe once you heard about this special way of organizational structures in cultural institutions and even in universities. I will pick up another question from the box.
Before we go there, can I just come back on the female leadership question? Because somebody, an anonymous person, has...
and there was the question is or the comment is that it sounds like female leaders still have to be much better than male who is aspiring a similar goal.
I think there's definitely truth in that. I think it's worth saying. And let me qualify anything I say here in point of fact that I'm a man. I do not have lived experience of what it's like to be a woman leading. But I work in an organization that has worked on this issue for the last 18 years, not exclusively, but as part of our attempts towards diversity. And I think there's a real truth in the example that Toby gave around Nicki Minaj, because it takes the innovator and the change maker in the space who might have to bend in the way that Toby said in order to get into the space. And yes, that there's an inequity to that which is not right, but it takes those change makers to change everybody's value set. Nobody would question somebody else coming in doing similar things to Nicki Minaj or somebody like that, or Lady Gaga, or any of these artists who are doing things that nobody else is doing, because they are innovating. And it honestly does take time, and we're increasingly getting better and better examples of where this works. To take it back to Johan and my bit of the world, the classical music sector, female conductors, it's the classic argument, where are they? They used to have to wear shoulder pads, quite literally. You talk to Maren Alsop, who I've worked with a fair bit, she used to have to effectively pretend to be a man, and that's not right. But she changed the conversation. And if you look at female conductors now, it's still not equitable, but it's changing. And the expression of conducting has changed. It's not just the typical Furtwängler or the classical examples of what that heroic leadership looks like. There are different ways of expressing this, which might produce not necessarily better or worse, but different and more interesting and more diverse results. So it's really worth focusing on that. You need the trailblazers, and then they create the space in which others can then come and occupy space.
And I think you should begin further and further. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying, I also think it's important to note that, like, where for men, the access might not require the same level of bending or sort of bending, but I think for anyone to come into a space and do what we're suggesting, to lead in the way that we're suggesting, that whether you're a man or a woman, you need to have thick skin, and you have to have some resilience and everything, because there's going to be pushback, because this isn't comfortable and people aren't used to this idea of leading with heart or dispersed leadership or grassroots leadership or community-based or people-based and everything. And so that type of message and that type of movement will be, I think, pushed back on regardless of who's doing it.
So true.
Yeah, and it's important, still the question, can you learn it, or do you have to bring special personal or individual skills to take your room and to own the space, like you said? But I think it's important to start at the school programs or even in the universities, that you can directly have the possibility to train this, to learn it right now, even if you are, from the personal skills you bring with you, a shy person, but this won't mean that you can't get there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about the learning it. I absolutely think it's not even like can you learn leadership. I actually think you can't be the type of leader we're talking about without learning. You know, this is learned behavior. This is some type of learned ideology. Because the reality, I think, is that the way that we have situated leadership, or people understand leaders, it's more of a personality trait that they're talking about, like people that are born confident, or they're outgoing, or they're willing to step up and take on that's more of a personality trait that makes them maybe right for leadership, but that doesn't make them a leader. And I think that to be a good leader, it takes some learning and unlearning based on everything of how we've been educated all around the world, and how we've been miseducated. So it's like when you're talking about gender oppression and hierarchy and community-driven decision-making and white supremacy and change and innovation and servant leadership and all of these different race, we have to learn those things, right? And so if we're saying all of those things are really important for leadership, then yes, to be a good quality leader, absolutely. It's a learned experience. It's just not something you step into just because you're a confident person, or people listen to you and you're good with words, or that type of thing.
Yeah, that's totally right. And there's something about the cultural sector embracing that will, and this speaks also to what Johan was saying around the way dispersed leadership can move, and the way different styles and thoughts and processes in leadership can embody themselves. And we will all benefit. I think that's the thing that increasingly as a sector, and this is across countries, across continents, I think we're all starting to understand the level of benefit that we will receive from being more open to these other formulas for what leadership looks like.
Yeah, and the last web talk, we talked a lot about good leadership in the way of defining this term. So this is also something you mentioned, Toby, that this is learning, but also get new perspectives and the difference between a leader. We talked also a lot about charisma and this special personalities, which we don't mean by saying good leadership will direct in another. I would like to ask Johan, you have this special master program at the University of Groningen, and the people attending this master program, they are going into cultural institutions and they are able to transform. This is the goal everybody wants to focus, to transform maybe into new cultural institutions. What is your impression? Is this a new generation you are rising up there in Groningen?
I hope so, yes. The research master also prepares them for a PhD, so that is another option that they can continue even further research on the topic. But yes, and we are still observing where they are going to spread out. The program is not that old yet, so we are really curious to see where they're going to be able to apply their knowledge, and whether there's a real new generation of leaders coming up. And I just wanted to say one more thing about the previous discussion about how we reflectively deal with the concept of leadership in our sector could very well and hopefully spin off to other sectors as well. It wouldn't be the first time that we as a cultural sector break grounds for new ways of looking at management or entrepreneurship practices, for instance. So I really hope that will happen as well. We're not only here to only lead ourselves, but actually lead others as well in that respect. Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that the whole 5 web talks, the others we had before in German, and even this perspective you delivered for us today will also count on this, so that all the people attending us, they come out of our web talks with new ideas, and probably with examples where they can learn more, or maybe if there has been the one student who would like to go to the university in Groningen to study there, or to attend one of the wonderful programs at Clore Leadership. I think you gave a very, very good insight in what you are doing there, what good work you are doing there. And I would like to thank you very much for this web talk today, for attending us from the United States of America, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. And I would thank you all participants and attendees here in our web talk. We will have a little break and then be there with another term, with another subject we will talk about at the end of April. You will know this via newsletter and every channels of the Kulturpolitische Gesellschaft. Thank you very much, Toby, Jonathan and Johan, and thank you very much and goodbye to everybody who was listening out there. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.